Mortis Maledictum is a cosmic dark fantasy story, and as such may contain content not suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Now, enjoy the show.
Here you are again, prepared to turn the page. You know the risk, and know the danger. Let us begin.
The deep ocean hosts an uncountable variety of life. That was the pitch Hugo Belisar used many years ago when he stood before a room full of investors. There is so much they didn't know, and experience was the best teacher. Hugo proposed an undersea laboratory where researchers could live and work for weeks at a time, unburdened with the loss of time and money dealing with decompression. That really was the limiting factor on research time. There was a distinct amount of minutes a diver could stay under the water without risking decompression sickness. Hugo had done a cost-benefit analysis and he presented it to the investors. They had agreed with one stipulation. There should be a proof of concept first. Enter the Aquarius Reef Base. Hugo's expertise lay in persuasion, and he gave it his all to bring the first base to life. It was built, manned, and administered all by different organizations, and he kept his name and those of his investors out of it. If it had failed, they would have been protected. Instead, the experiment went better than Hugo could have dreamed. By the fourth year of operations, his investors greenlit the true undersea base, and construction began in secret. The Sea Lab experiments of the 1960s proved people could operate at depth for prolonged time periods, and the Aquarius Reef Base showed how it could save money in the long run. Each mission day only cost $10,000 aboard the Aquarius. Hugo knew he'd be able to make a bigger habitat at a much deeper location. The price tag was astronomical, but after 6 years, a team of 5 ships, 200 engineers, and marine scientists, the Aegis research vessels set out from Monterey Bay. Their destination was not far off the coast. A gigantic rift gave the Monterey Bay its marine diversity, appropriately named the Monterey Canyon. It ran from the coast all the way out to the abyssal plain thousands of feet below the surface. Hugo held his breath as the team descended in waves, each installing way stations for compression and decompression. Once completed, the engineers lowered the Aegis down along a submarine rail system with pulleys to keep it on track. Finally, after the slow progress of days, the Aegis arrived to its new home anchored to the side of the canyon, 5,000 feet down. At that depth, the researchers and divers would need to take their time at each of the way stations to normalize their body pressure. It meant that help was a long way away if anything went wrong. It also meant that the longer the scientists stayed between surface visits, the more money Hugo would save. The first mission was set, and the divers left to start their 200-day expedition. Nia held her breath. She didn't need to, despite how far down she was. It just always made her nervous setting off on one of the long dives. She and the rest of the team had been down on the Aegis for 60 days already. They were breaking records and discovering new things on better than a daily basis. Nia never got used to it, though, the feeling of the submarine disconnecting from the Aegis life support. The hull pinged as they descended into the canyon, which didn't help.
Relax,
Alex said from the helm controls on Nia's left. Nia checked a pressure readout in front of her. It displayed the expected reading, but her nerves remained.
Leave her alone,
Desmond said from the rear of the submersible. His deep voice felt tight and constricted in the high-pressure vehicle.
I'm just saying, this is what, our 26th dive in this sub? And in all that time, has there been a single thing go wrong?
Alex held his hands up in a defensive gesture. There's always a first time, Nia replied. Her palms were sweaty and she wiped them on her pants. Desmond ran the sub's arms through the basic movements as they dropped deeper into the Monterey Canyon, making sure they wouldn't have any articulation issues once they reached their station. One of the first missions the team did once they arrived on the Aegis was to take the subs down further and plant supply points. These were pods similar to the Aegis, but much tighter and with no habitat or living quarters. Essentially, they were large storerooms with spare parts, air tanks, and sub-batteries. The only way to install fresh batteries at depth was with the arms, and Nia appreciated Desmond making sure they worked before they needed them. Everything went according to the mission plan, and Nia knew she had been nervous for no reason. There had only been 2 missions with mechanical issues, and both involved their other submersible. The team had 2 research subs and 2 maintenance subs. The maintenance subs were the ones that ran the supplies out to the supply points along the canyon walls, heading down to the bottom. The team arrived at their destination a few minutes early, which would make Hugo happy. It was his neck on the line for every second they were down there. The boss gave them a long leash, but he also demanded constant news and fresh data for him to show his panel of investors. While Nia didn't give a damn about what Hugo thought, she did what he wanted because without him, the whole team would be sitting in a dry dock somewhere. When the expedition first launched, the number of new discoveries astounded everyone, both on land and on the Aegis. But as with all things, humans are great at adapting. Now, even the most unique discovery barely got their attention. Hugo wanted more, and so the team went on increasingly risky missions, deeper and further out.
Guys, there's an issue with the pressure seal on the right articulator.
Desmond called from the rear.
Can you work around it?
Alex asked. The kind of notification would have sent the team shooting for the nearest supply point a few weeks ago. Thanks to Hugo's pressure, it barely rated a note on the dive log.
Yes.
Desmond replied, sounding irritated.
I might be able to fix it while you're collecting samples on the other side.
Nia reached out and took control of the left articulator. I'll work with this one. It gave Desmond the space he needed to attempt repairs with a cable-driven repair vehicle. It was only about the size of Nia's hand, but the little guy was damn helpful and had a bunch of onboard tools. It didn't have a name, but the team took to calling it Leo. The team maneuvered over to a cold seep near the canyon's base. There, they were studying organisms that lived under a different set of rules as the rest of the world. Food chains start at a synthesizer. Most synthesizers are plants that use light from the sun to make their fuel, but light was a precious commodity down there. Instead, there were organisms that latched onto different kinds of vents where useful chemicals poured into the ocean. They used a process called chemosynthesis for their fuel. It was to study those creatures that had paid for the whole place. Aegis, the subs, even Nia's paycheck came from what they discovered about the near microscopic organisms in the Monterey Canyon. That was until Leo snapped a cable. Alarms blared and Nia's screen flashed red. Alert! Pressure seal broken, displayed across them in huge lettering. The vessel immediately drifted to the side as the pressure tried to equalize, causing an unequal amount of force on the sides of the sub. Nia unbuckled herself from her seat and spun to help Desmond. Later, Nia discovered the Leo had gotten tangled in its power hose, and when it pulled loose, the housing around the connection's base came free as well. This caused an imbalanced pressure, leading to a micro crack in the sub's pressure seal. She knew none of these things in the moment. The only thing Nia saw was a haze hanging in the air and Desmond desperately trying to rip open a patch kit.
Hurry up!
Alex yelled. He couldn't correct the drift while the pressure continued to produce thrust. The leak propagated around the rest of the hose just as Nia and Desmond got the patch kit in place. They resealed the vessel as their eyes popped painfully. The sudden absence of the opposing force made Alex overcompensate and the sub slammed into the canyon's wall. Desmond slipped from where he stood and hit his head on the side of the interior hull. Nia just kept her feet and put her hands out to brace herself from the rocking submarine. It bobbed back and forth as Alex slowly reduced the thrust from the motors.
Is everyone all right?
He called over his shoulder. Desmond's down.
I'm all right.
Desmond said, but his voice sounded pained and he had held his hand to his head. There was a cut along his bald scalp and blood ran through his fingers. "Let me take the wheel," Nia said. She knew Alex was better at first aid and she desperately wanted to get them up off the bottom of the canyon. The little sub took off from the bottom and she pointed it straight for the nearest supply point. She couldn't see this far down, but kept the wall in sight of her outboard lights, her sonar leading her upwards. The haze was still hanging in the air inside the sub when they reached the supply point. The water had come into the sub in such small quantities at such a high rate of speed that it had vaporized itself. There was a mass spectrometer back in the Aegis, and Nia was sure someone back on land would be interested in it. Either way, she was going to mess up that potential experiment when the airlock chime sounded. The pressures equalized. Nia wasted no time in ripping open the hatch and stepping into the storage unit. There, she found a better medical kit and gave it to Alex, who was still tending to Desmond's head. The large man also had a banged-up arm, and he rasped when he breathed. They needed to get him back to the Aegis soon, since the surface was out of the equation. They fixed themselves up and installed a new Leo, this time with a certain amount of trepidation around the patch kit. Alex got back in the driver's seat and moved the sub back towards their home on the side of the canyon. Robin was one of the technicians who lived on the Aegis, and she was the one on board when Nia's submarine limped its way back up to the docking hatch. The other tech was out with the other dive team working on restocking all of the supply points. Her and the backup divers, Bruce and Jillian, made up the welcoming committee when Nia and company got back. They had maintained radio contact, so everyone knew what was going on, and they had tools, spare parts, and more medical supplies ready for them when they arrived. The hatch opened and Desmond cried out. Alex and Nia were still looking the other way, intent on their control displays. There was a crashing sound and then a screeching which had no place on a submarine habitat anchored to the wall of a canyon. Nia slipped free of her safety harness and looked behind her. The shock made Nia's own cry die in her throat. She saw Robin, or what was left of her, face bloodied and half missing, staring out at her. Desmond held his arm up to his nose. Then the smell hit her too. It was the stench of death, of rotting bodies. Robin was moving. Her contorted face attempted to say something, but the screeching sound of pain and anger was all that escaped what remained of her lips. Robin tried to reach out to Desmond with bloodied fingers. Alex reacted faster. He batted her hand away and barreled through her and into the Aegis. Nia used the space to move past Robin's sprawled form. Desmond didn't make it. Robin got up and scrambled into the submarine and shut the door on her and Desmond. The Aegis was built in 3 main pods, each separated by heavy metal doors. These doors allowed the crew to seal themselves off if there ever were life support issues in one of the other sections. It didn't matter which direction Nia looked, she couldn't see any of the other crew members. They could have been in one of the other pods, but the silence was worrying. What happened up here? We were only gone a few hours. A moment later, Nia heard the crackle of the radio on the nearby table. Desmond's voice sounded terrified.
"Oh my God. What has happened to Robin? Help me. She sealed us in."
Robin's voice interrupted Desmond, but he still held the radio's transmit button.
"It's all right, Desmond,"
she said, her words anything except calming.
"Something's gone wrong, but I'll take care of it."
The radio cut off. A second later, Nia heard Bruce come over the speaker.
"What's going on? I heard someone yell."
Nia turned towards the closed pod doors to see the left one spinning open, just as Bruce's head peeked through the submarine behind her detached from the dock, heading back out into the deep water.
What are they doing?
Bruce asked, then keyed the radio to speak to the sub directly.
"Hey, what are you doing? Desmond needs medical attention, and we don't know that patch kid's stability." "No, I can't."
Desmond's wild voice responded.
"I have to keep her away from you. She's gone crazy. Decompression or something, I don't know. Just don't come after us."
Bruce had been standing in the doorway holding the radio, but after Desmond's transmission, he stepped fully into the pod with Alex and Nia. Their first reaction was the same as before. The smell was inhuman. Nia could see him clearly now. He was normal old Bruce, except the green oozing wounds on his legs. She could see parts of the bones sticking out, and yet Bruce wasn't screaming in pain or writhing around in agony. Jillian stepped through the door immediately after him, and finally, the answer fell into place. Jillian came fully into the pod. She was covered in blood-soaked clothes and black stains. She was wearing elbow-high rubber gloves and held a knife. It was one of the sharp-pointed implements they use to dissect samples. She stood so relaxed. The sight made Nia's skin crawl.
What's going on?
Nia asked, fear and disgust tainting her voice.
Whoa, we were gonna ask you the same thing.
Bruce said. He must have seen the fear in her eyes. He leaned forward and held his hands out like he would with a rabid animal. Behind him, Jillian stepped forward too. As they advanced, Nia stepped back until she felt the cold steel of the hull.
Stay back,
she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. Something crawled across Jillian's face. It looked like some sort of aquatic millipede. They kept coming and Jillian still held the blade. Just before they were in arm's reach, Nia lunged to the right. She went under Bruce's outstretched arm and ran to another of the pods. There, she sealed herself in. A clanging sound echoed off the door as the locks engaged.
Naya,
came Jillian's voice over the radio speaker in the back of the pod.
where do you think you're going, Naya?
Nia held down a small button on the speaker.
I don't know what's going on with you, but I'm not going to let you in. How could you do that to Bruce?
There's nothing wrong with me.
Bruce said. His voice was twisted somehow, spiteful.
Bruce, how could you let her do that to you?
A knocking sound came from the other side of the pod door.
Let me in. I'll show you. There's nothing wrong.
There was a threat in his voice that carried over the radio. Hugo built the vessel as a research station. It sat on the side of an underwater cliff with billions of liters of water above its head. The chances that they would need to worry about locking a psychotic would-be murderer out of a pod were small. They hadn't built locks to only work one way. The locks on the pod doors were for sealing off sections of the vessel against leaks, and you had to be able to do that in either direction. It also meant that after a few turns of the knob on Bruce's side, he could have the door open again, and Nia wouldn't have anywhere left to hide. She did the only thing she could to save herself at that point. She lifted the glass case on the side of the wall and smashed a large red button. Half a second later, she heard the crashing of the pressure and the static of her radio cutting off. The pod separated from the rest of the vessel. It would rise to the next waypoint up along the rail system they had used to bring it down. She would escape, and she breathed a sigh of relief. Jillian and Bruce weren't so lucky. They had opened their end of the door and were in the process of unlocking Nia's pod when she fired the separator. Pressure and icy water rushed in and drowned them within 10 seconds. For Desmond's part, he struggled against Robin in the submarine, and he ultimately subdued her. He threw her against the inside of the hull, cracking her skull as he had done before. As for Alex, he had never made it out of the depths. His body lay in a tangled mess within the sub with Desmond. Nia and Desmond had killed him out of fear, and then forgot. Nia would survive, and over the next week, she would slowly recover from the poisonous chemosynthetic bacteria she, Alex, and Desmond had inhaled in during the leak. It had caused them to hallucinate, raise their heart rates, and terrified them with visions of their friends in half-dead forms. They had thought something had happened at the research vessel while they had been in the deep, but it was they whose sanity the bacteria had replaced. When she reached the surface, doctors examined Nia and wrote down everything about her story. It took many more weeks, but dive teams were able to recover some of the wreckage of both Desmond's submarine, which had crashed into the seafloor, and the scattered debris from the main pod. Hugo and his investors lost millions of dollars. The team lost their lives, and Nia answered for it.
Thank you all for listening. We hope this episode reminded you there are things in the deep. The only method we have to support our show and continue producing these stories is from generous contributions from our supporters on Patreon. If you want to help us continue making this show a reality and get access to our exclusive storyline, click the Patreon link down in the show description. We offer a free week of unlimited access to all new patrons. Thank you for listening and for all your support.